Hello. Great. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Ember Borja. I'm a web developer. I've been doing it professionally for 5 years now. I work remotely for a company out of Cleveland, Ohio by the name of Tiger Pistol. We do advertising space work. And I want to talk to you today about web accessibility. It's a very important topic that hasn't been hit on enough, in my opinion. So I'm hoping to expose you to it today. Only have 15 minutes to talk about this, and it's a really broad topic. So this is just going to be an introduction. But yeah, so let's get started. So before we can talk about web accessibility, I want to break it down and let's talk about accessibility. So the definition of accessibility is it's the practice of making information, activities, and or environments sensible, meaningful, and usable to as many people as possible. So there's a lot in that sentence to unpack, and so we'll do that over the next 15 minutes. I want to give a concrete example of this concept by looking in the context of architectural design. So hopefully something that we've all seen before is handicap parking. So this is an example of accessibility of a physical space, right? So, there's a ramp instead of stairs, so someone who uses a wheelchair can enter a physical space. And so, we've got a general definition, an example. So a philosophical definition of accessibility is not about solving a disability, right? So in the example of handicap parking, the curb is the problem, not the wheelchair, right? The wheelchair is a piece of technology that helps someone get around. So accessibility is about accepting and respecting solutions and technologies in order to enable alternate means of access. So that's accessibility. So let's dive into some examples of accessibility users because it's a really broad umbrella of a topic. So an accessibility user is someone whose access to information, activities, and or environments is impeded by a temporary, recurring, or permanent condition. So some examples of that is cognitive, physical mobility, auditory, verbal, or ocular disability. It could also be someone's, their age, language, culture, education plays into that. There's a lot of assumptions that are packed into even something as simple as language. So the internet needs to be robust enough so that someone whose language is left to right or right to left can still access the information that they need. And some other things to keep in mind is economic position, which leads into technological access. So if you are in a certain economic position, you won't have access to technology. If you don't have access to technology, then your technological aptitude is not at the same level as someone else. And in a lot of software development, we rely on certain mental models that a user might have. Say, everyone's used to an infinite scrolling because Twitter's had it for a decade, but maybe not everyone can make that same assumption. So we've talked about definitions of accessibility. Now I want to show you what accessibility is not. This is what I thought was a pretty funny example. So this is an input, put in your phone number, and it's not accessible because this is really hard to anticipate. And so, I pulled this off of Twitter. This was the bad UI subreddit. But yeah. All right, well, I hope that was your phone number. If not, start again. But yeah. So now I want to start going down the rabbit hole of what is web accessibility, right? So it's broken down into two parts, usability and conformity. So usability is a benchmark, right? It's more of a vibe. Usability is dependent on each user's use case because, depending on the disability or all of those factors that we talked about, that's a pretty broad set of circumstances, right? So it has to be contextual upon the user and their disability. You can't always achieve 100% parity of someone who has like the full sensory modality experience, but you can shoot for the benchmark of is this usable, right? Is this sensible, meaningful, and usable so that a disabled person can have like access to your information? So, and also, it's important to think about each person's use case because sometimes use cases conflict with one another. So you might have to duplicate your data, but it's presented in different formats so that you can account for everyone's use case. So the other half of web accessibility is conformity. So conformity means that you're adhering to the specifications and also any regional laws that might depending on where you are, so that you're conforming to accessibility standards. So the specification is through the World Wide Web Consortium, Web Accessibility Initiative, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. That's a mouthful, but if you want to know where it's at, it's on GitHub, so you can see what are the current standards, what standards are currently in review that might be coming soon. The current version is 2.1, but version 3 is in draft form. So if you want to see what's coming down the pipe, you can go do that by going to either the links that I mentioned. And also for us, if you're working for a company who receives like federal funding, right, you have to be what is called Section 508 compliant. And you can go to section508.gov in order to read up on that. It's a whole thing. I only have 15 minutes, but it's important. So why should you care? I've given you some examples of accessibility and definitions. So the World Health Organization estimates that 15% of the population self-reports as having a disability. And that's huge, right? That's a large market share. There's legal ramifications under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So even if you don't receive federal funding and you might not be Section 508 upholdent, you still can be liable to a lawsuit if you're running a business. It needs to be accessible to people with disabilities. So, but most importantly, I mean, it's just the right thing to do. Everyone wants to be treated right. So, like if your grandmother has Parkinson's or, just like shaky hands, she still needs to be able to use a website, right? So don't make your inputs super tiny. So examples of poor accessibility, I have 3. This is a non-exhaustive list, but so something that's pretty common is maybe you're reading a Medium article and it's like you got the title for the article, you've got an image that someone picked out to be on top of the article, and then below it you've got the content. And if you look at the alt text on that image, it might be something super weird, or maybe it's like the title of the article. That's not helpful. That's not describing what's in the image. So descriptive text is needed for your alt attributes on your image tags. Using non-semantic HTML, that's a big one, especially if you have a component library like React. People have your UIs and these different components, and in order to take those composable components, put them together to make like a new user interface, like a new page, right? But you still have to have the mental overhead to think about, okay, is this semantic HTML? Is this going to be useful to someone who's using a screen reader or another assistive technology? And another example of poor accessibility is, I'm sure everyone's had like a pop-up ad, right? And then the way to get that ad to go away is the world's tiniest X that you can barely see in the corner, and if you miss it by a millimeter, all of a sudden you're on some ad page for who knows what. So this is a quick example of like what I mean when I say semantic HTML. So I'm sure a lot of people's React code looks like this divs everywhere. None of it is meaningful to someone who's trying to look at the structure of the web page, but HTML5 is really robust, and there's lots of elements, and those elements are useful to someone who is viewing your page with an assistive technology. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on that, but so I do want to give one example of great accessibility. Shocker, it's on the Web Accessibility Initiative's website. But every YouTube video that you view on that website is through this media player. And this media player is really great. Like, it's got large buttons, it's got a title, high contrast, you know exactly like which input you're looking at. You can use it with a mouse. You can also use it with a keyboard really easily. And if you hit Control Plus and you increase the size of the text on the web page, the layout doesn't break. It's really graceful and responsive. And below every single video, they have a transcript of what was the audio in the video. And then not only that, they even have a description of the visuals that were used in the video. So someone who is blind can still use a screen reader and get, a much richer experience. Like, they're not missing out. So, all right, I've given you some examples, some definitions. I've reeled you in. You're excited. I want to do accessibility. So this is how you can test your software for accessibility. In the Chrome DevTools, there's a Lighthouse section. A lot of people use that to check like their SEO or the performance of their page load. There's also an accessibility audit that you can do, and it gives you a score on how accessible your page is. Something that we do at Tiger Pistol is that whenever we create a new section of UI, so our React code, we've got a new web page, we're making something new, we always make a test file to test our UI. And when we write that, we follow a certain practice of writing our assertions as if you're looking through the code from with an assistive technology. So you can actually target those like ARIA attributes, those assistive technologies. And so it forces us to think about the UI that we just made from the perspective of a disabled person. And then it's a sanity check to make sure that we're not putting code out there that's going to hinder someone's user experience. Also, if you have a quality assurance team, they can just use assistive technologies to do a sanity check as well. And if you need to be Section 508 compliant, the Section 508.gov has a tool that can tell you if you are compliant. I'm going to have two more examples of how you can test your code for accessibility. This is through the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, the page. So it gives you like a checklist. It's really long, and I only have 3 more minutes, so I'm not going to go over every single one. But the biggest thing is, so like page title, right? So the page title in this example is, KYJSUG. It's the little tab right up in the browser. So if you're in a boot camp and you do create React app, you spend like 3 days busting out your portfolio website. You're like, oh, this looks really great. I'm really proud. And then you look up at the browser tab and you're like, oh, that's a React logo, and it just says React app. That's so it's a little embarrassing. But yeah, so don't forget your page titles. Let's see, something else that I might want to hit on. Okay, forms. Something that I see all the time is when someone's creating a form on their website, they're like, oh, I don't want to have a label. I'm just going to use my placeholder text, and it's going to be a label for the component. Don't do that. That's not what a placeholder text is meant for. Use your labels or use some of the aspects of HTML5 in order to make your code accessible. And then moving, flashing, and blinking content. If you have like a video or something that's blinking or flashing, if it's longer than 5 seconds and if it automatically starts, you have to put the controls for the user so that they can stop that. Something else to think about is, like, say you have a carousel, like you have a kind of like a slide on your website, right? And the content's on there will stay for a couple seconds, then it moves, and now there's new content in that carousel. You have to have the ability for someone to like pause that, right? Because they need to take the time to read it. And then lastly, web accessibility evaluation tool list. Super robust, 167 tools on here. If you, for whatever reason, you're like, oh, I need to abide by Germany's specific accessibility standards, go under guidelines, it's got it in there, you're covered. All right, so I wanted to talk about like how to keep accessibility in mind. It's easy to think about this from the beginning. So you can go test your code and you realize, oh no, I wish I had thought about this like months ago. So a way to start from the beginning is, like, if you have a product management team and they're thinking about new features, they can think about accessibility. When you're writing the code, you can think about accessibility. quality assurance when they're testing your code to make sure everything works and they're doing a regression tests. They can use assistive technologies to make sure that you're compliant. And then if you are shipping code to production, if it doesn't pass your accessibility automated tests, it can't go up. All right, so most importantly though, you can hire or consult a person with disabilities and get them part of the conversation. All right, so that was a lot of information, but all of my materials and slides are online. You can go through the Bluegrass Developer Guild GitHub or through the Kentucky JavaScript User Group Discord. And yeah, thank you.